William Shakespeare wrote a lot about love. His play, Romeo and Juliet, remains one of the most passionate and insightful pieces ever written on the breathless and all-consuming nature of young love. And in one scene, as the sun rises after Romeo and Juliet's wedding night, Romeo has to get out of town. He's been sentenced to death for accidentally killing Juliet's cousin, and both he and Juliet know he'll get killed if he stays. And Romeo says to her, "Night's candles are burnt out, and jocund day stands tiptoe on the misty mountaintops. I must be gone and live, or stay and die." And of course, Juliet can't bear to see him leave so soon, so she answers, "Yon is not yet daylight, it is a meteor that the sun exhales. Therefore stay yet, thou needst not to be gone." And consumed by all uniting love, Romeo replies, "Then let me be taken. Let me be put to death. I am content, so thou wilt have it so." And that's kind of a Zen moment when Romeo says, "Let me be taken." Sheltered in Juliet's arms, awash in endorphins and oxytocin, he sees all of reality as one. Man, woman, life, death, infinity all meet at a central point, which is exactly what Zen masters tell us enlightenment is. And love can do that for you. Romance is such powerful stuff that even being around someone in love can be uplifting. And I think it's precisely because romantic love is so powerful that it actually has a very uneven history. The words to our hymn this morning, "Though I May Speak with Bravest Fire," actually come from St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians in the New Testament. But Paul was not talking about romantic love. The Greek word he used was agape, often translated as love of and for God. There's a second Greek word for love, philios, love between friends, and Paul used that one too now and then. And you probably also know there's a third Greek word for love, eros, which refers to earthly passion. In Romeo and Juliet, their eros for one another contains the other two as well as everything else. It's that all-consuming. But 1,500 years before Shakespeare was born, St. Paul didn't see it that way at all, and neither did anybody else. Paul was decidedly nervous about eros and never used that word in his letters at all. For what it's worth, the Romans were nervous about eros as well. Eros was necessary for procreation and keeping the empire strong, but the Romans also thought too much of it weakened a man, and men were seen as the default gender in Rome, of course. Going back to Christian love, the most important Christian theologian after St. Paul was a Roman called Aurelius Augustinus, better known to us as St. Augustine. And Augustine was a scholar of surpassing brilliance and deep insight into human nature. He was also as neurotic as they come. He was plagued by insecurity and guilt, and not least guilt about his own sexuality. He was deeply passionate, actually, and for his first 30 years, he lived life to the fullest. He tells us in his writings that when he was a young man, he would pray, "Lord, grant me chastity and continence, but not yet." He had a string of mistresses and felt guilty about them. He fathered an illegitimate son and felt guilty about that. But as he grew older, he focused all his passion on a very narrow view of religion. He believed passion, eros, was only acceptable when it was 100% devoted to the worship of God. Give it to God. Eros by itself was sinful. It could only be good when it supported agape, love centered on God to the exclusion of everything else. That set the tone for Christian attitudes toward romance and love for the next 1,000 years. Augustine became bishop of the city of Hippo in North Africa. It's near Carthage. But everywhere he looked in 400 AD, the Roman Empire was collapsing. The Goths sacked Rome itself when he was in his 40s. By the time he was old, the Vandals had conquered Spain and Morocco and were pounding on the gates of his own city. As a young man, he had believed that Rome was eternal and invincible. As an old man, he was disillusioned by Rome's collapse. It convinced him that nothing human could be of any value at all. And with this in mind, he reinterpreted St. Paul's writings about Adam and Eve and the nature of sin, and he turned the Adam and Eve story into a catastrophic fall of all humanity. In other words, 400 years after Jesus died, Augustine came up with the concept of original sin. Mistranslating a line from Paul to do it, he wrote that all humanity was corrupted because of Adam and Eve's mistake. On our own, no human being could hope to do anything good. Anything good. And I think it's worth mentioning, both St. Paul and St. Augustine wrote that Adam and Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden was not lust. It was failure to obey God. God ordered them to stay away from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but they sampled the fruit anyway. Augustine called this sin, the original sin, the sin of concupiscence, turning away from God. That was the sin. Lust, with all its complications, was the punishment. Augustine didn't know a thing about hormones, of course. The way he wrote about it, when we are in a state of desire, even when it's not socially acceptable, say for someone when you're not properly married, our body seems to have a will all its own. It refuses to obey us the same way Adam and Eve disobeyed God. That's the punishment. And later he wrote, quote, "What friend of holy joys would not prefer to beget children without this lust?" I'm going to let that question pass without comment, but it is worth remembering, I think, that that Augustine's attitude toward Eros was totally Roman. Hollywood movies to the contrary. Romans were a pretty puritanical lot, at least emotionally. Men, again, that was the gender that mattered, were not supposed to waste too much virility or passion on women. It weakened them for more important things like scholarship and making money and politics and war. As for women, they were pretty much property, high value property, but just a means to an end. As a Roman man, Augustine was actually puzzled that God even created women. It seemed to him that if God wanted to give Adam a really good companion, God would have created another man. At least then Adam would have philios, deep affection for a friend, and not shameful passion, eros. As far as Augustine was concerned, women and eros had to mean that God was punishing us. As one of my shipmates in my Coast Guard days might have put it, I think Augustine was one sick little puppy. Furthermore, to Augustine, and this is for the record, gang, this sin of concupiscence, the turning away from God, meant any non-godly interest, including family. With the development of family values rhetoric, more recent religious writers have soft-pedaled this point of Christian doctrine. But Augustine was very specific. He deserted his common law wife and son to enter the priesthood. And when his own mother died, he wrote, quote, "It distressed me greatly that human feelings had such sway over me. If anyone finds sin in this, that I wept for my mother, let them not scorn me." Even weeping for his dead mother was to Augustine concupiscence. It was sin, turning away from God. Now, Augustine was doing something that people often do, which is take our own doubts and prejudices and canonize them, you might say, telling ourselves that they are, in fact, God's universal will. Now, for the record, I don't believe human prejudices are God's will. But Augustine's attitude was typical enough and his argument was convincing enough, he was a brilliant writer, that for the next 1,000 years, eros, passion, became a one-way ticket to divine anger. God was willing to forgive, but don't take forgiveness for granted. Also, for the record, going forward, Martin Luther pretty much agreed with Augustine. Luther had been an Augustinian monk before he broke with the Catholic Church, and though Luther eventually did get married, he never questioned Augustine's attitude toward eros. He wrote, quote, "The bridegroom has a surpassing affection for the bride, yet it is contaminated by that leprous lust of the flesh, which was not present in righteous Adam before the fall." Calvin took a dim view of romance as well. Calvin wasn't inclined to get married at all. His friends had to talk him into it. He was working too hard. They told him his health was declining. Maybe a good woman would make his life easier and bring out the best in him, which is pretty much the way it worked out in the end. They found him a nice widow who already had kids, and Calvin's career as a religious leader really took off soon after that. But of marriage's conjugal joys, Calvin wrote, quote, "Marriage is a veil by which the fault of lust is covered over so that it no longer appears in the sight of God." Apparently, if Calvin was going to beget children, he was nervous about God watching. God as a possible voyeur. Who knew? Calvin was also a sick little puppy. In the meantime, through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, poets were singing about love, but it was complicated, influenced by Christian ambivalence toward earthly love. Medieval courtly love was not supposed to include married couples, for example. Proper marriage was not about love. It was about procreation and economics. Courtly love was not supposed to be consummated either. When love went too far in medieval poetry, disaster always followed. Tristan and Isolde, Heloise and Abelard, Lancelot and Guinevere. When love moved below the waist, the lovers suffered the consequences, both in this life and usually in the next. Medieval literature's great love affairs, including my own personal favorite, Geoffrey Chaucer's Troilus and Crusade, were sinful by the religious standards of their day. The reader knows the lovers are going to suffer because of their love, which makes it all the more tragic and passionate, of course. We feel sympathy because of our common bond as human beings. We understand the lovers' longing for one another, and we care about them, not least, I think, because we know we share their yearning in some way. So it was that medieval poets, and even more Renaissance poets who came after them, touched a real spirituality of the human condition, which church leaders had avoided. In a real sense, poets deserve our thanks for redeeming romantic love, love as a spiritual reality. And for that reason, I personally find the writings of Chaucer and Shakespeare sacred in a way that Augustine, Luther, and Calvin don't even approach. As European culture evolved, it took poets to sound that crucial spiritual chord which preachers had for 1,000 years ignored or put down. And in my view, that's a chord that religion needs to be complete. We are complete human beings, our whole lives, you might say. Not unlike the great medieval romances, we feel compassion for Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, his star-crossed lovers, he calls them. They're good kids. They deserve a much better fate than they get. They're up against political and cosmic forces they don't really understand and have no hope of overcoming. So they perish, and we grieve for them. And part of Shakespeare's genius is that in his plays, he's always developing several ideas at once. On one level, he agrees with society. Love needs to be tempered by wisdom. To love unwisely is to ask for real trouble. But Romeo and Juliet's love transcends wisdom. On the one hand, we know their love doesn't stand a chance due to the politics between their two feuding families. On the other hand, we know that their love should stand a chance. The problem is not with them, it's with their families' refusal to even try to get along. And Shakespeare makes very plain that's where the real crime lies. So in Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare asks a good question, and he asks it in other plays as well. Just how much right does a society have to dictate who can fall in love with whom? Shakespeare doesn't give a good answer to that. He leaves it up in the air. But it's an important question, and I think it's even more important in our own time than it was in Shakespeare's. Chaucer and Shakespeare are both just a couple of examples how artists can be more spiritual than churches. To me, religion is not complete when it's kept too separate from the everyday world in which we humans live and love and struggle in our own lives. Religion and reality, theory and emotion need that poetic connection, or else real spirituality gets lost. Jewish theologian Martin Buber wrote that God is a poet. And the only way to really understand the poet is to deeply consider the poem, the world and life around us. And to me, religion is very much about learning to read the living poetry of our existence. Which brings us to one of my favorite theologians, Friedrich Schleiermacher. 14 centuries after Augustine and 3 centuries before our own time, right around 1800, Schleiermacher, who was a German philosopher, theologian, wrote with passion and poetry that religious feeling, quote, is as fleeting and transparent as the first scent with which the dew gently caresses the waking flowers, as modest and delicate as a maiden's kiss, as holy and fruitful as a nuptial embrace. Indeed, not like these, it is itself, all of these. Close quote. In other words, the maiden's kiss is a holy thing in itself, and so is the nuptial embrace. So is the world itself. And he goes on to write, to love the world spirit and joyfully observe its work is the goal of our religion. Augustine would have been flabbergasted. He probably would have called the police. But the first time I read Schleiermacher, I thought, wow, now we're really getting somewhere. Schleiermacher and those he influenced, among them some Unitarians and Unitarian Universalists, have done a lot to reclaim the full spirituality of being human and also being in love. Part of that was reclaiming that romantic love. And what's more, Schleiermacher and those who followed him did a lot to reunite the various forms of love separated in Greek vocabulary, and even more by Augustine. I question whether love even should be separated into agape, philios, and eros. Put them all together, and you really get, in the words of the song, nature's way of giving a reason to be living. Moreover, we reflect that any name or terminology we put on a relationship is simply a word. And of course, in Zen, words cannot package up the full reality of our lives. I think it's a good point. To Martin Buber, we don't become fully human except in relationship with one another. He tells us we exist as humanity, not in isolation, but in the completeness of relation between person and person and person. And Buber's not just talking about love here. He's including the person you just run into in the subway. Relation is about respect, about openness, about willingness to change and be changed, what he calls the I and thou relationship. To Buber, this is where we become most open to the full reality, which is within us and surrounds us and reaches beyond us, which he calls God. So, at the height of his love for Juliet, Romeo says, "Let me be taken. Let me be part of whatever the world brings me. I am content." Love can do that for you. May each of us be so fortunate. Amen. May it be so.